So there's this faction of the ANC linked to Ramaphosa who essentially, I think, were quite happy that the ANC would lose. And my own view is if you go and look at Ramaphosa's own behavior on the campaign trail for that election,
strange, right?
He was behaving in a way that was obviously going to annoy voters and reduce the party's vote share. For somebody who's generally very suave, I mean, he's the kind of person who will be suave and diplomatic with his worst enemy, but he couldn't hold himself on the campaign trail to be the diplomatic, suave, charming guy that he can be. The people at the top of the ANC were working against the ANC to bring it below 50%, and it had to be substantially below 50% because otherwise they could have just gone into a coalition with a couple of small parties and then boom, they're above 50. So it had to be substantially below in order to make the case for a coalition with the DA. Why did the media write all these puff pieces, all these like praise pieces about Rise Mzansi and Songezo Zivi prior to the elections? I mean, it was blatantly partisan. You know, and anybody who's watching this can go and look, just go back on the internet, find articles from prior to the election, see what they were writing. Look at the fact that they didn't declare their funding sources until they had to legally. You had Magashule Ghana was interviewed and asked about this. He said, no, we get our donations from ordinary South Africans. Then it turned out basically they got almost all their money from one of the Oppenheimer family. And what was their response to that? He said, oh no, she's an ordinary South African. I mean, I worked in government, I worked in parliament, I've worked in various parts of the public sector. I know that our cybersecurity capacity compared to like the US, which is the main country that actually wants to manipulate our election results. It's not Russia. Yes, Russia wants to manipulate our election results, but the country that most wants to manipulate them and most has the capacity to do it is the United States and its allies. And again, that's something you'll never read about in News 24. News 24 is always about Russia and China, Russia and China.
In a world where Africans have lost their roots, it has become of vital importance to document our ways. In an effort to reverse the brainwashing of the past, where we were made to believe our ways are demonic, we are pressed to create dignified and respectful platforms to unpack our spiritual ways.
The views and opinions expressed in this episode are those of the guest and do not necessarily reflect the beliefs or position of this channel, its hosts, or affiliates. This podcast is a platform for open discussions and exploration of various perspectives, including controversial and unconventional ideas. We encourage viewers to think critically, do their own research, and form their own opinions. The content is for informational and entertainment purposes only and should not be taken as fact, advice, or an endorsement of any specific viewpoint. Viewers' discretion is advised. Umoya ulight, umoya ubright. We have missed you guys. Welcome back to another episode of MOYA Political Series. It's always such a privilege to have you. Thank you so much. We see the numbers are growing. Thank you so much. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. And especially thank you to the members for helping us keep the lights on. Really appreciate you. And we encourage more subscribers to become members. So, MOYA Political Series, this is a school where you are going to learn the things that they're not going to teach you in the white schools. And today we have got, I never call you by your white name. I'm going to go by your black name, Mfundza Muller. We have lots of interaction online on Twitter. He sometimes hosts Twitter spaces with us to just unpack the economy, social issues. Mfundza, it's such a privilege to have you, and thank you so much for honoring the invitation. Molo.
Thanks very much for having me in person. Great to meet you in person, and looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you. So, I mean, let's start you as a white person in South Africa. We started right there.
I thought we might get into that on sort of the third episode. Yes, that's actually that's a long chat, and I feel like I want to write a bit more about that maybe before I talk about it, because there's a lot of context to be unpacked. But I mean, the short version for me really is that I have the good fortune in my case of coming from what was effectively a 2-generation anti-apartheid family. So my grandparents, my South African grandparents, were in the anti-apartheid movement from the 50s. And then my parents were also in the anti-apartheid movement. And I was born in Mozambique. because my parents were working for the Frelimo government there post-independence. And they were also at a low level, but also at a subtle level, working in the anti-apartheid movement. So we moved to Johannesburg when I was quite young, I think 5. And then, grew up in Johannesburg, grew up in South Africa. And that's really the background that has formed my perception of South Africa, my understanding of South Africa and the world. Understanding white South Africa was something that really only happened for me when I left home and went to UCT. Because the thing is that in my family, of course, we had lots of friends who were white, but they were almost all in the anti-apartheid movement. So they were not representative of white South Africa. So this is also why when people say, give a perspective from a sort of white South African perspective, I said, I don't really have that to give you, or if I give it to you, I'm inferring it from what I've learned myself. So my perspective is quite different to the majority of white South Africans, and I think that probably comes across in a lot of the commentary that I provide, I guess.
But then they must have, besides your family and your home upbringing, when you now start seeing outside, what happens to you inside? Well,
look, without going into a lot of detail, going to UCT was quite a shocking experience, actually.
Yes. So why?
Because basically a large number of the other white students were racist, and overtly racist. And I guess in some ways it shouldn't have been shocking, but the thing is that these are young adults, they're teenagers, and they've spent most of their teenage years in the post-apartheid era, right? So this was 2000, if I'm aging myself, and so they should have spent about, pretty much their entire teenage years in post-apartheid South Africa. But of course, they're learning from their parents, they're learning from their communities, and so what I learned going in probably with a high expectation, or at least a neutral expectation, was that the vast majority of white South Africans were still very racist. And unfortunately, I'm not sure I think it's changed a bit. I think it has improved, but I don't think it's improved anywhere near as much as it should have. And I think the other problem is that which kind of couples with this, is that a lot of the power structures have remained largely unchanged since '94. So you have this combination of a lack of adequate change in attitude and worldview, combined with the maintenance of deep power structures. One of my favorite examples is Naspers. Naspers is the country's biggest media conglomerate. It was established as an apartheid propaganda organization, as part of the apartheid propaganda machine. And the chairperson of Naspers now is Koos Becker, who is the son of somebody who was reportedly an apartheid intelligence operative, right? And his CEO is reportedly the daughter of somebody who was exposed as an Askari who was spying on Winnie Mandela. These are the two highest level people in this organization. And it took Naspers, I think, I can't remember the exact dates, but it was 15 or 20 years post-apartheid to formally apologize. And as we know, that kind of apology doesn't really mean anything. And when you look at how Naspers reports on things, like News 24, for example, you still see that very strong bias. And you know that people, it's not to say, I do try and be a little bit cautious, because it's not to say that all journalists, or even most journalists, don't want to report the truth. But what they learn very quickly is what gets rewarded and what gets punished. You want to make it up to editor level at Naspers, you're going to have to toe a certain line. And if you don't, you won't make it up there, or you won't last very long, right? So these power structures stay in place. So anyway, you were talking about the personal, but essentially this, and I think also white South Africans have been, and that would be another whole discussion, but white South Africans have, in some sense, also been very poorly led, I guess. This lack of transformation of attitude amongst white South Africans is largely a function of the leaders of these white communities, also staying stuck in their attitudes. Even, you look on the so-called liberal end of the spectrum, but for those of us who remember, somebody like Tony Leon, who is sometimes praised as leading the growth of the DA. He led the growth of the DA by taking voters from the National Party, which was kind of collapsing at that point under Martinus van Schalkwyk, and adopting a fight-back campaign against the ANC. And this was before, nowadays people like to sort of justify their anti-ANC stance by saying, oh, but there's corruption or that. Yeah, that's another whole chat. But the thing is, back then, a lot of that corruption had not happened. And what had happened was not yet visible. So that justification wasn't there. It really was just a backlash against, a black majority government. And unfortunately, as I say, I mean, and the privilege that came from colonialism as well, right? Not just apartheid, but colonialism and apartheid, has been sufficiently maintained and not challenged, that people also haven't had to adapt their worldviews, right? So it's a big problem.
So I see you sometimes on Twitter and you're even having to deal with black people who don't quite understand. I mean, can't we just get on with it? I mean, I've got my job. Like, what do you mean when you talk about these power structures which haven't changed?
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is, I mean, they're not, in my experience, I think the vast majority of black South Africans, and maybe even the vast majority of South Africans actually, I mean, so, I'm very critical of white South Africans as a group. What's interesting, though, is that even across the political spectrum, even with right-wing people who I would disagree with about almost everything, but they're still interested enough in truth that they'll also be willing to entertain, the possibility that some of these things are happening. And they also don't like the fact that democracy is being manipulated by some of these billionaires, the Koos Beckers or the Oppenheimers or whoever it is. But anyway, with that said, so I mean, there are not that many people that actually give me difficulty for my views. But in terms of this question of, why can't we move on? I mean, I think also, I listen to the radio every now and then. I try not to listen too often or watch TV too often because it's just so frustrating because of just how effectively captured the South African media is. And that includes SABC, just down the road. I mean, the situation with the SABC, and again, the way this kind of propaganda works is like, the DA, for example, will make a lot of noise about how captured the SABC is, to distract from the fact that actually right now, the bias in the SABC is pro-DA. And I want to give a very specific example, actually. I'll post about it maybe later today or later in the week. Last week, the host of the SAFM primetime radio show was interviewing Helen Zille about various things. I think it was the anniversary of the DA.
Hey, Helen Zille's on a PR run for this thing.
Which is also very interesting, right? And there's a whole lot to unpack there, and you can see maneuvering that's been happening to like boost her image, and also what's happening in the city of Johannesburg. There's a lot we could talk about there. But this presenter was interviewing Helen Zille. There's a question for me about how all these presenters are being appointed, because this is somebody whose specialty was like sports journalism. Now they're hosting the Drive Time show, which specializes in current affairs and politics. There's no transparency around these appointments. It's a public institution. I have reasons to believe that a number of these appointments are very dubious, right? And I would love to see a lot more transparency around what's happening there, and I think we should, because they're public institutions, right? But putting that aside, this individual is interviewing Helen Zille, and he's asking about this young DA MP who was just poached by the Patriotic Alliance.
Yes, Liam.
Right? I think, Liam Jacobs. Okay. And Zille is very defensive about this, and she says basically, in not so many words, that they know how Gator McKenzie is taking their people, and he's basically buying them. And she knows how the cash flows. It's hard to prove, but we know how the cash flows. We know how the money moves. Now, you'd think that a serious journalist would love this. It's an amazing it's an amazing statement to have. These parties are supposedly in a coalition. She's suggesting serious skullduggery, right? So surely a journalist would be like, oh, tell us more. What's the information? What are you suggesting? Instead, he says, no, but aren't you guys in an alliance? Aren't you friends? No, let's move on. Let's move on. What kind of journalism is that? So if you pay close attention, you can see whether it's NASPAS, whether it's 702, whether it's SABC, that there are these controlled narratives. And so, unfortunately, also, I think people are not sufficiently aware of just how they are being manipulated. This like the adoption of this narrative, like, oh, the ANC is corrupt, oh, this like post-colonial corruption thing in African countries, that's a propaganda narrative. It's not to say that there isn't any evidence to support it, but the United States is an incredibly corrupt country. The United Kingdom is an incredibly corrupt country. Who were all the governments that were behind the arms deal that was supposedly the big thing that corrupted the ANC? A whole bunch of foreign governments and foreign businesses, arms dealers, right? These people have just disappeared into the background, and we're left with this notion that, oh, the ANC is corrupt. Oh, African liberation movements are corrupt, right? So you can't just move on because you don't actually have a good enough grasp of the facts, and that's because those facts are being manipulated and distorted and withheld from you, unless people actually have the time. And I'm very sympathetic to people because, one of the reasons we have like media outlets and academics who are also failing terribly in this country, we have all these people, is essentially it's like a societal outsourcing. Your ordinary person doesn't have time to go and read all these books or do this research or interview people and so forth. So we kind of outsource it within society, and we have these institutions that are supposed to do it for us. But if those institutions get captured, or for whatever reason they're not doing their job, then we're deprived of this kind of information, right? So yeah, it really is important to understand how these power dynamics are working. And I mean, I think that the GNU is a great example, so we can get to that. But that's what I would say in response to a lot of those people is that a lot of what you think you know is not very accurate, or at best, it's kind of, where it is accurate, it's distorted. You're only getting like part of the story, right? So like ANC corruption. Okay, true, there's definitely been corruption in the ANC, serious corruption. But who were the main movers in that? Oh, that's kind of lost to time, right? And why is that?
So when we speak about these power structures, what are you speaking about?
So I have to be a little bit careful one has to be a little bit careful, as we were talking about before we started this,
yes.
with how one talks about these
yes.
things and who one talks about.
Yes.
Because even if you have good reason to believe something, certain things can't actually be said in the public domain unless you can prove them, right? But so, I mean, the obvious example, and I'll be writing more about this, might start my own podcast, we'll see, just because I realize that basically you can only reach a small proportion of people these days by writing, which is what I do on like my Substack and so forth.
Yes.
So I'm realizing I might need to do more of this, okay?
Yeah.
But let's take a look at the billionaires, right? So this is something that we can talk about because it's within the realm of what is discussed, okay? So, but again, there's a slant to it, right? So when people talk about the manipulation of like democracy in the US and they talk about billionaires, they usually talk about right-wing billionaires, right? So they'll be talking about, although Peter Thiel is kind of donates both to the so-called left of the spectrum. There is no left in the United States, okay? So he donates to the Democrats and the Republicans, right? There are others, the Adelsons, I think, who are apparently very close to Trump, that kind of thing. Then it starts becoming a bit sticky when you want to talk about people like George Soros. George Soros, who's supposedly on like the liberal end of the spectrum. Now, Soros is a very important person. I find him quite an interesting person, by the way, because one of the areas of academic work I do is philosophy and methodology of economics. And Soros has made some interesting contributions to that because he studied philosophy and he was supervised by this fairly famous philosopher, Karl Popper. Anyway, but Soros is important because Soros is behind the Open Society Foundations. And the Open Society Foundations have been funding a whole lot of civil society initiatives in South Africa. Okay, so they've had a significant influence on public narrative, on so-called civil society. I mean, this whole notion of civil society is very problematic. Because what does it mean? We talk about civil society, in my mind, we're talking about people movements. Movements emerging from the community, from collectives of people in a kind of more organic, grassroots kind of way. But the vast majority of organizations that operate in what we would call South African civil society are basically billionaire-funded fronts, okay? Now, sometimes they do good work, but again, it's this thing of there's certain things they won't do, there's certain things they won't say, and there's certain kinds of people and initiatives they will promote because they serve a particular set of interests. And I want to emphasize that these are not just, people will talk about like capitalism and that kind of stuff. This is bigger than just economic interest. This is about ideology. This is about power at the global level, at the geopolitical level. It's about making sure that the United States can access critical minerals it needs from South Africa, which means, it needs to have, the government in place needs to be amenable to that, right? So that's going way beyond just like securing, okay, I'm a businessman and I'm a billionaire businessman. Who's this guy? Jeff Bezos of Amazon. I want to make sure that Amazon can make a lot of profits in South Africa without having to pay too much tax. So Elon Musk wants to start Starlink here, so forth. Yes, those kinds of capitalist interests come into it, but that's actually not the most interesting part for me. What's most interesting is the geopolitical side. So when you're talking about power structures, as I say, billionaires, right? So there's Soros, who's an international billionaire from another country, and he's funded a whole lot of people here, including some of your, including at least one of your competitors in podcasting, and somebody who I don't want to mention them just because I don't want to promote them. I'll get to them. I'll get to them in good time. But they didn't declare the fact that they got hundreds of thousands of rands from the Open Society Foundation.
And as
part of a project to influence young people's perceptions of democracy and in the run-up to elections. Now, that looks, on the basis of the facts, like a billionaire, a foreign billionaire, meddling in South African democracy through people that they use as fronts. Right? And I think it's legitimate to treat them as fronts when they're not declaring their funding sources, or they declare them much down the line. And they'll tell you, oh yes, it's a very interesting thing. They try and construct a win-win for themselves. If either the information is somewhere in the public domain, so if you come across it, right, it'll be buried on a website, three layers down. You'll come across it. So when they challenge you and they say, how do you know this? You point them to the website. And they say, oh, but it's public information. If you come across it through a private source, okay, then they'll say, but where's the public evidence? You see, so they try and get a win-win. If you have public proof, they'll say, oh, but it was in public. Yeah, but the average person is not going to go and look at the website, behind the website, and then dig through the annual report and find it. If you're like a podcaster receiving money from George Soros, that should be on your front page, right? Unless you're trying to hide something. And why are you trying to hide that? So there's George Soros, okay, but Soros is not even necessarily, I think he is pretty interesting in the South African context, but another South African billionaire who I think is very interesting is Michiel Leroux, who's one of the people behind Capitec. Now, as far as I know, and I heard this both from a private source, and then I also came across a public source of this information, Leroux is behind a trust called the Millennium Trust. Okay. Now, the Millennium Trust funds Daily Maverick, Amabungane, Council on South African Constitution, Freedom Under Law. As far as I know, I'm going from memory here. But so you've got all these civil society organizations, all these media outlets being funded by this anonymous trust. I mean, I've gone to look at the directors. You would never guess from the directors of this trust. You would not be able to find out who's behind it. I only found out because I stumbled across something online and because somebody who had direct knowledge of it told me privately that Michiel Leroux is behind this. Okay. Now let's put that together. Michiel Leroux funds the DA. He funds the Democratic Alliance. So he also funds their court cases. He funds the civil society organizations that apply to the court to be friend of the court in court cases. And he funds the media houses who report on all of that. Okay? Now, how do you think as an ordinary person, you're going to be able to get accurate information on, for example, who's corrupt and who's not, who's good and who's bad? This is just one billionaire. When they control three, right? And those are just the ones we know about, right? That's not even like particularly covert. As soon as you know who's funding the trust, you can figure that all out, right? There's a whole lot of other stuff that we know less about or we have to find out about through private sources, right? Like who's funding Rivonia Circle, right? Which is another thing which I've raised over the last couple of years. And Rivonia Circle was really the platform that Songezo Zibi used to start Rise Mzansi, which eventually we discovered was funded by the Oppenheimers. Okay, so basically these power structures matter a lot, and right now under this current coalition government, in my view, they are driving everything that's happening. The political level is actually a bit of a distraction in my view, and I've said this to you before. Whether it's these supposed dramas between the DA and the ANC, all of which I think are actually distractions. They're designed to distract people from the fact that actually the shots are being called at a different level that we're not seeing. So it matters.
And speaking of the shots being called, we said this earlier on, in my view, it looks like Helen Zille is the Tumamina of the global powers.
It's complicated. I think, and this is, I'm not going to name specific people, but one of the reasons also I've come to understand these things is just because, at some level, just by accident, I found myself in like social networks or the edge of social networks or the edge of professional networks in which many of these people operate. I'm sure, as you know, like certain parts of South African society are very small.
Yes.
You end up on a particular scholarship program, and suddenly, you get to know people who then end up working for particular organizations,
Yes.
getting certain kind of funding,
Yes.
getting put in certain kinds of positions, and so forth. You go to a particular university or whatever it is. So, I've learned a lot about these dynamics from some of those kind of accidental things, but I pay attention. So when it comes to somebody like Zille, yes, I mean, Zille is in some sense the de facto leader of the DA. I mean, Zille is the power behind the book,
Yes,
right?
yes.
And Zille is close to, for example, the DA's funders and other influential people who have leverage, whether it's in civil society or in the legal profession, for example. Whether Zille is, their main, what do you call it, like stalking horse. I mean, I find this idea of putting her forward for the mayor of Joburg a bit strange. And it also, one of the interesting things is it kind of talks to almost a lack of options. I mean, I was saying this the other day in relation to another podcaster who suddenly, become very successful, getting gigs at ENCA and so forth. And again, it's pretty much just because they're being promoted by the same set of interests. I'm sure you know who I'm talking about.
Yep, I also noticed that when
yes,
it happened.
exactly.
And also I found the timing interesting because I had just started my podcast and it was becoming quite political. And even the way he started doing his interviews started becoming more...
Political.
Yes.
Instead of just
like how it used to be.
Yeah, exactly. Like basically empty, vacuum.
Right? So that's when I saw, snap.
Yes.
White capital is actually now starting to fund my competitors and lifting them up so that I look smaller and people don't quite...
Whenever there's a space...
So interesting.
Whenever there's a space, they feel the need to control whoever's influencing that space. So this is the whole thing, like this whole notion of like alternative media. I mean, it's alternative platforms, but the thing is the power brokers are the same, like the billionaires and so forth, so whether it's like Rob Hersov or Michiel Leroux or George Soros or whatever, those kinds of people co-opted the traditional media. But they didn't co-opt the traditional media because they actually care about co-opting the traditional media. They want to control the narrative. So if the platforms shift, they're also going to shift. They're also going to find their people, their stooges, whatever. They're going to find them, or they'll actually create them. I mean, that initiative by the Open Society Foundation, which was framed, of course, they always have the right language. We want to encourage young people to get more interested in democracy or whatever it is. But ultimately, it's about controlling the narrative and determining who the main actors in those spaces are. But the thing is, but the other thing is that...
Because then, continue.
As a consequence, they have to hide it, because the thing is that I think if most people understood what was going on, they would not follow these people. They would not uncritically listen to what they say. They would not become fans and so forth. So that's where the layer of deception then comes in, right? But then that's very two-faced, because these are the same people who are saying like, oh, we must have open democracy, we must have transparency around funding. I mean, literally the organization, the civil society organization, I've actually forgotten its name now, but the civil society organization that has been bringing lawsuits and supposedly, this is their main thing, is focusing on political party funding. They're funded by Michiel Leroux, one of the main funders of the DA. So, like I say, he controls, and I criticized them at one point because what it seemed to me was that they were bringing lawsuits, but they were leaving out certain things. And they were not raising issues that would have been inconvenient for Leroux. So that's like the level of sophistication as well. So they bring some legitimate issues, but then they leave out other ones, right? So, yeah, unfortunately, it's really important to understand the level of sophistication with which these things are happening, and the desire to really control all these outlets. Because, I mean, even now, whatever challenges you may have had or whatever with your podcast, but any alternative outlet of an independently minded person, just independently minded, but especially critically and independently minded, is a threat.
Yeah.
Right? Because what happens if suddenly 200,000 people start following you tomorrow and you're criticizing these kinds of things, or they start following me? They're really scared of that.
Yeah.
So they invest a lot of money in trying to avoid that kind of situation. But fortunately, to some degree in South Africa, we do still have a kind of, even though there's a captured democratic system, but we have certain kinds of democratic rights which are not yet being infringed upon. So we can push these boundaries as we're doing.
Thank God. Right?
Yeah.
It's really
We're not living in Rwanda or in fact the United States, where somebody can come and just kick down your door without a very good reason and then arrest you and, you have to prove your innocence.
And even in Kenya, they keep arresting the activists and Rwanda, like, I'm always like, my gosh, hectic.
Yeah.
So now, the thing is that you talk about the sophistication because people really don't see it. People don't see that the people who fund the political parties, fund the media, fund the banking system, so, I mean, how is it that we can conscientize people? Because essentially, I mean, there's only a few names you've mentioned, but that's them. And they control politics, they control the banks, they control... And it's also fascinating how black banks never make it unless there's a white somewhere in there.
Yeah.
But the white banks, superstars.
Yeah, well, this is another thing which I hope to get into at some point. But there is this... the first thing is, like, for example, somebody like Michiel Leroux, his role is essentially unacknowledged in the public domain because he's hiding behind this trust, at least based on the information that I've come across. So we haven't even gone to step one. So that would be step one, is just to acknowledge that this is happening, right? To have it widely recognized as the case. Step two would be to say why. I mean, there's other Capitec billionaires, right? There's other wealthy people in the country. What is his agenda and where does it come from, right? And that's an interesting question. But in terms of conscientizing people, I think really making them aware of these kinds of things and essentially, I mean, it's going to require legitimately discrediting a lot of these outlets. I mean, so for example, why did the media write all these puff pieces, all these like praise pieces about Rise Mzansi and Songezo Zibi prior to the elections? I mean, it was blatantly partisan. And anybody who's watching this can go and look, just go back on the internet, find articles from prior to the election, see what they were writing. Look at the fact that they didn't declare their funding sources until they had to legally. You had Magashule Ghana was interviewed and asked about this. He said, no, we get our donations from ordinary South Africans. Then it turned out basically they got almost all their money from one of the Oppenheimer family. And what was their response to that? He said, oh no, she's an ordinary South African. In what world is a billionaire, an Oppenheimer billionaire, an ordinary South African? So they were lying, right? They were lying. They were exposed to be lying. But again, because the media was on Rise Mzansi's side, it was essentially it wasn't swept under the carpet because it's there, just swept aside. It's just irrelevant. It's the reason why we still don't know we still don't officially know who's funding Rivonia Circle. But as you know, I went and did some digging on that, and I have at least one very credible source who told me the Rivonia Circle, which is this kind of supposed civil society organization. And I mean, look, it's a bit of a joke. This is the funny thing. Because if you looked at Rivonia Circle, I mean, I had some friends who were joking about it as well. They were having all these glitzy events, expensive hotels. Nobody was really attending. You could see it was just a performance. And it was a performance funded by a lot of money. It was clear that there were rich people behind it. But because the media is essentially influenced or controlled by those same people, they never asked that kind of question, right? But as far as I know, Rivonia Circle has been funded by the Brenthurst Foundation, okay, and the Brenthurst Foundation is just a functionary of the Oppenheimers. So again, it's the Oppenheimers, right? And it makes sense. So the Oppenheimers fund Rivonia Circle, which was like a little stepping stone for Songezo Zibi from his private sector work into politics. He was also working for the Open Society Foundation. He was on the Open Society Foundation board. So Oppenheimer's, Soros, Songezo Zibi, and the big banks, because he was essentially a comms person. And that's fine. There's nothing illegal about.
But we didn't know him as a political player.
Yeah, I mean, he made some political commentary that was critical of the ANC, and my guess is that is essentially where he was identified.
Exactly.
That's also how it works, right? They look for people, and look, they're well aware that, if they put forward, if you put forward one of the Oppenheimer children as your political candidate, they're going to bomb. Even white South Africans are not going to vote for them, right? So you need fronts. So what do? You look around for people who's saying the kinds of things you like, and they look a certain kind of way, right? If it's not Songezo Zibi, it was Musi Maimane. It was Herman Mashaba, right? Herman Mashaba, it's interesting now, Herman Mashaba wants to pretend that he's now this sort of almost African nationalist person, whereas those of us, I used to track him for no reason other than the fact that I was an economics student, and he was in the Free Market Foundation. And the Free Market Foundation, in the entire time I can remember, just have always been producing right-wing, pro-corporate nonsense. right? There was a time I used to like write into Business Day and stuff, like responding to each like lie that they put out, you know. And after a while, I just got bored of it. But that's what they've been doing all the way through. And Herman Mashaba was the, I think, chairman or president of the Free Market Foundation. Now he wants to pretend, oh, they've just become right wing now. It's not true. Same with somebody like Jonathan Jansen wanting to pretend that the Institute for Race Relations suddenly became right wing. It actually it went from being a liberal right organization to a fully extreme right organization under his watch. And then it was inconvenient for him, so he tried to wash his hands of it. So these kinds of things as well. I mean, the good thing is all this information is out there. It's all public information. But most people don't have the time, and they also don't know like how to look. But the interesting thing is, you know, and I've also had to learn over time. I mean, so for example, one of the things that I think messed with my understanding of what was going on was the state capture period. So I am of the view that state capture did happen. You know, I went and sat in those hearings, and I understand why some people think that it was a bit of a circus, right? But I went and sat in those hearings. You know, there is something, you testify under oath, that does carry weight. If you lie under oath, there can be serious consequences. People can prosecute you for perjury and so forth, in South Africa anyway. So, you know, I listened to a lot of the evidence. I also had some indirect information about some of those things from my own networks. And I'm pretty confident state capture was happening. Okay. But what was the point I was going to make about this? Oh yeah, so in that period, there were organizations, journalists, civil society organizations and stuff that were opposing state capture. I was also opposed to state capture. I'm opposed to any kind of corruption in the public sector, any kind of corruption that's basically going to harm the interests of the people of the country and the country, right? So I found myself sort of more proximate to those people. And I came to believe, especially the ones who I didn't know anything about before, I came to believe, oh, maybe these people are actually, maybe they do really care about this thing. And then as soon as that period was over, as soon as Ramaphosa came in, they just started ignoring all the kinds of things that were happening under the Ramaphosa administration. You realized that you were seeing like, you could see like their double standards. Suddenly I realized, oh, actually, most of these people, I was wrong. Most of these people were not opposing state capture because they cared about the public interest. They were opposing state capture because they were serving interests that essentially the Zuma faction was clashing with, right? Now, I mean, some of your, you know, many of your viewers, I'm sure, like, wow, yes, that's obvious. It wasn't obvious for me at the time. In academic research, we talk about, it's called observational equivalence. You have a piece of evidence, and you have two interpretations, and you don't have enough evidence to actually determine which one of those is right. So for me, that was one of those situations. It was hard to tell whether people were opposing bad things because they actually cared about the principles, or because they were serving these other interests. And the conclusion I've come to since then is that pretty much all of them. You know, I'm embarrassed to say, well, but I guess it's a good thing. I used to, for example, make small donations to Amabungane as an investigative journalist. Yeah, because I believed, you know, for a period of time, you know, they seem to be doing good work, and I really believe that they care about these things. Now I've seen subsequently that that's not the case. And I mean, you know, I've done work in energy policy, you know, economics of energy, geopolitics of energy, and clashed with Bungane when they were promoting this like anti-gas propaganda in South Africa, which was foreign funded. You know, so they allowed themselves to actually be, you know, this was, and also outside of their normal turf, you know, where it's normally investigative journalism. But in this case, it was like producing reports, you know, in response to demand. You know, do this kind of investigation.
Propaganda.
Do that, exactly. Do that kind of investigation. So, you know, those kinds of experiences have shown me that unfortunately, the vast majority of these organizations and individuals are not committed to the principles they claim to be committed to. They're selective. You can't be selectively committed to a principle, right? So if you're observing a principle selectively, you're being driven by something else. And unfortunately, my conclusion is that's the case for all these organizations and most of the people. But at least I can say that actually I gave them the benefit of the doubt. And for a period of time, I believed in them. But ultimately, the evidence has overwhelmingly been in the opposite direction. So the interesting thing also is, like, we look at, you know, the whole state capture thing, which is still playing out now. We just saw some former Transnet executives who've been arrested. Now, I personally believe they were involved in corruption. And this is one of the unfortunate things about Jacob Zuma's second term, is that I think he tried to do some good things. But unfortunately, he did those in parallel with a whole lot of corrupt things. So he's discredited all of those things. Unfortunately, that's just how it's been. And he's given people a lot of ammunition. But what we also see is that it's interesting to see, like, even the prioritizations of the corruption cases in state capture. Why is Cedric Frolick he's a parliamentarian, ANC parliamentarian, in a very senior position in Parliament. He was in I worked in Parliament, by the way, for 2 years, and we interacted directly with Frolic. He was in a very senior position then. He's still in a very senior position now. He was implicated in the Bosasa corruption by Angelo Agrizi, okay? The media says nothing about him these days. Why? Why? Somebody's such a high level in Parliament implicated in this thing. But if you're Brian Molefe, right, why would they go for Brian Molefe? Well, because he's in MKP. He's kind of a thorn in the side. And when I say that, I'm not saying, I believe that he, based on the evidence, he probably was involved in corruption and he should be held accountable. But we see these double standards. Even Malusi Gigaba, they're taking a very long time to get to Malusi Gigaba. Why? Well, he's not being a problem right now, in essence. Yeah, the other strange things, I mean, I know, for example, I follow, some of your work, of course, and I know you've been very involved in the EFF, MKP sort of debates. My view about that is that really it's a distraction. I don't think it's a distraction in the same way that the ANC and DA thing is a distraction. The ANC DA thing is a completely manufactured drama. And it's a manufactured drama, like I say, to distract from the fact that they're both having their strings pulled by the same people. So you have to have this illusion of contestation to keep the public believing that, but it's not happening. They're all pushing forward with the same agendas, okay? And all of this is just performance. Now, EFF and MKP is different. Like, I think those tensions are genuine, okay? But at the same time, it's still a harmful distraction. Because the people who support these parties, who care about some of the issues you and I are talking about, are getting distracted by all these dramas. They're not paying attention to what we were talking about just now, about the fact that basically you've got all these billionaires, these foreign governments and so forth, who are pulling the strings behind the so-called GNU, behind energy policy, transport policy, privatization of rail, massive rent-seeking that basically these people are setting up. I suspect also in higher education, I think that's coming, health, right? So it's going to be like my view of what is planned under this so-called GNU is basically large-scale legalized looting of the public sector, right? Health, education, which are two of the biggest budget areas, right? To do a lot of work in public finance. Everybody knows about the state-owned enterprises and the energy transition, right? And I've been going to a few events in the energy transition space, always, fancy hotels and so forth, foreign-funded things, and just saying, how are you guys dealing with the conflicts of interest here? Why are you taking money from foreign governments, right? So anyway, there are all these things. And so unfortunately, these battles between the EFF and MKP are a distraction, right? But the other thing that I wanted to say, though, the reason I got onto that example, I was thinking about this when I looked at some of your recent debates, is, we know that, for example, the NASPAS group, they hate MKP, right? Yeah. And I mean, their editors will actually be open about that, which is incredible, given that it's a party that has 13% of the vote, right? They don't like EFF, maybe they hate EFF as well, and they've been very negative about people like Floyd Shivambu, okay? So they've been pretty consistent about that. Strangely, when Floyd Shivambu left EFF to join MKP, the criticism of Floyd Shivambu in that press died down. It's a bit strange.
Quite.
Right? Because surely, logically, you'd think that if a group of people don't like a person and they don't like an organization and that person and organization come together, they would criticize them more. But they went very quiet. So, the thing is that MKP, I've written quite a bit about what I think happened with the elections last year. I do think that they were heavily manipulated, if not outright rigged. A good anecdotal example of this, I found an interview with Gayton McKenzie, 2022, just a reasonably random podcast, and he predicted in that podcast that the ANC would get about 40 to 41% in the elections. Now, bear in mind, at that point, the ANC was polling low 50s. I'm sorry, but I don't think Gayton is that insightful. No. I don't think he's that insightful.
I think he was sitting with the white people who are planning ahead.
People like Rob Hersov.
Listening. Yeah.
And Hersov, literally the only good thing about Hersov is that he's been very overt about a lot of what his agenda is, which is to remove the ANC and to put in place proxies, whether it's in Nhlanhla Lux, whether it's Herman Mashaba, and so forth, right? Or even certain podcasters now who he's been endorsing. So there's this, with those elections, my view was well in advance that the result had effectively been decided one way or another. Yeah. And the question was how it was going to be made to happen in more or less legitimate ways or more or less illegitimate ways, right? So, you can have outright rigging, okay, and that can be electronic rigging. And I've said, elsewhere that I think South Africa's capacity to combat that kind of interference and manipulation, it's just embarrassingly low. I mean, I worked in government, I worked in parliament, I've worked in various parts of the public sector. I know that our cybersecurity capacity compared to the US, which is the main country that actually wants to manipulate our election results. It's not Russia. Yes, Russia wants to manipulate our election results, but the country that most wants to manipulate them and most has the capacity to do it is the United States and its allies. And again, that's something you'll never read about in News 24. News 24 is always about Russia and China, Russia and China. And of course, yes, they're big powers. And in Russia's case, more so, the Chinese, I think, are very much you do your thing, we're going to do our thing, we're going to try and secure our interests in an economic kind of way, but we're not going to try and overthrow your government or control your politicians or your political leaders, as far as I know. Whereas we know that the United States has got a history of doing exactly that, but you won't read about it in News 24. Okay. So my view was that those elections were always going to be manipulated in some way, and the question was how. And I don't know if the MKP I don't think Jacob Zuma created the MKP for that purpose. I think he had his own agenda, which I think was pretty clear. But it seems that the MKP served that agenda because of the large amount of the vote that the MKP captured. It pushed the ANC below 50%, which is what they were aiming for. I mean, I spoke to at least one person on the ANC NEC before the elections, and I was saying, I was hinting that I had concerns about this kind of thing, and they intimated that a coalition with the DA was most likely, and B, there were movements happening in that direction. So there's this faction of the ANC linked to Ramaphosa who essentially, I think, were quite happy that the ANC would lose. And my own view is if you go and look at Ramaphosa's own behavior on the campaign trail for that election,
strange, right?
He was behaving in a way that was obviously going to annoy voters and reduce the party's vote share. For somebody who's generally very suave, I mean, he's the kind of person who will be suave and diplomatic with his worst enemy, but he couldn't hold himself on the campaign trail to be the diplomatic, suave, charming guy that he can be, right? So I think Ramaphosa and others were working, people at the top of the ANC were working against the ANC to bring it below 50%. And it had to be substantially below 50% because otherwise they could have just gone into a coalition with a couple of small parties and then boom, they're above 50. So it had to be substantially below in order to make the case for a coalition with the DA. And again, this is, in some ways, it's obvious. And again, if any investigative journalists had done their work, I mean, this is stuff that I come across kind of in my spare time, in passing. If it was my full-time job, I'd probably have 12 sources in the ANC who could confirm this, right? So it means that either these journalists didn't want to know, or they knew and they didn't publish because basically it would go against the interests who are essentially coordinating this whole thing, right? So this whole GNU is really manufactured. It's a dubious manufactured coalition by the people who are pulling the strings in the DA and in this particular ANC faction. And that's not good for democracy, So in my view is actually that election is probably, so again, of course, these media outlets trumpeted it as like a triumph of democracy. The Independence Party has now been, humbled, and it's left, it's given up complete power without a coup, all these stereotypes of, African countries and African political parties and stuff. But what's actually happened is that the interests that controlled pretty much the rest of society, the private sector, so-called civil society, the media, they now also control the political space. So they control everything. Right? And that's terrible, right? So, with the ANC in power, with more than 50%, there was at least some kind of counterweight, even taking into account the fact that lots of people in the ANC were compromised. But there was still some kind of counterweight between political power and everything else. Now there's no counterweight, right? And so we're kind of reliant on platforms like this just to try and poke small holes in this fake narrative that's being constructed. But it's very worrying. And so coming back to the Zille thing, what they're really trying to do is they're trying to set it up so that by the time of the next national election, they're going to close that down completely. There isn't going to be any hope of coming back from that. These interests will have secured full spectrum control, really, of all these dimensions of society. And you can play your little democratic games, you can run for political office if you want to, and so forth, but you're never going to have a chance. Haven't said anything about the judiciary. That's another area which I'm concerned about, but, yes, it is one of those areas where one has to watch one's words. But I'll say one example, and I actually wrote to the Judicial Service Commission about this when the interview was supposed to happen. Something like David Unterhalter, who was briefly on the board of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies, which is effectively a Zionist organization. They supported apartheid, although again they've tried to whitewash that, and they've supported apartheid in Israel. Right? They would say, "Oh no, you won't find a document where they say we support apartheid in Israel," but they'll effectively have supported the Israeli government at times, which is essentially the whole time, where it's been implementing apartheid policies. So Unterhalter was on the board of that organization. He also, I believe, acted for them pro bono, so he acted them on their behalf for free. Okay, so that clearly shows a dedication to the cause. He's been appointed to sit on the Supreme Court of Appeal. That's just the most obvious problematic case. I think there are many others. And I think this, again, this shift to judicial independence, which on the face of it is a good thing. In general, I'm supportive of the idea that the judiciary should be independent to serve its societal role. But why now? Well, one reason it might be happening now is because enough of the right people have made it to the highest levels of the judiciary that they can be safely given independence, right? Because they can be relied on to take decisions that will serve some interests and not others. Now, this is the kind of thing that we're not allowed to talk about, not allowed to. Why? Well, because, like I said, the civil society organizations who operate in this space, Judges Matter, I believe, is also funded by Michiel Leroux through the Millennium Trust. The Council on South African Constitution is funded by the Oppenheimers and Michiel Leroux, right? So they determine the narrative. And they would be outraged to suggest that there was any undue influence in the judiciary. I mean, I can't go into the details, but I have been close enough to some people in the space to believe that, unfortunately, that's not true. So this notion of judicial independence, it's at best very superficial, and at worst, it's kind of misleading.
Actually, I believe that the Zionists control the judiciary. And just based on my experience and how they moved, it was very eye-opening. And So
I'll just say that my sense is that they have undue influence in South Africa and other parts of the world. But I don't think they're the main players. And so maybe we can take a bit of a tangent here to some other commentary I've been doing recently, which is about what's happening with Israel, what's happening with the United States. There's a move at the moment, a kind of rhetorical move, to essentially pin a lot of stuff on Israel, right? So obviously, what's happening in Palestine, Israel is the primary actor, shall we say? But also, what's happening in Lebanon? Okay, again, it's Israel. What's happening in Iran? Okay, I mean Israel, yes, but the United States also went in and bombed. Okay. My view is that all of those people in Israel and in other places, right, who have endorsed or supported those kinds of actions must be held accountable. But the historical evidence doesn't suggest that Israel is, in a real sense, the main mover. The United States is the main mover. There's a great speech by Joe Biden he gave in the US Senate in the 1980s.
Yes, no, you're right.
Where he basically says, Israel is the best back then it was $3 billion. Now it's probably like $300 billion. I haven't looked at the numbers. Israel is the best $3 billion investment we can make to secure our interests in the region. If Israel didn't exist, we would have to invent an Israel, right? He literally uses those words. And I think that's remained the case. But it's getting complicated because the US has now made alliances throughout that region. It's got alliances with Saudi Arabia, dictatorship, Egypt, dictatorship. Again, we have people from South African civil society, some of these same people who will shout at the ANC about, when it slightly infringes on what they believe is a constitutional right. But they'll go and they'll have conferences and civil society functions and holidays in Egypt, which is an oppressive dictatorship. Turkey, quasi-dictatorship. the guy who's taken over Syria basically seems to be a US asset, which is also very interesting because he was basically on the Al-Qaeda side of things. But it's not as if the US hasn't founded and funded terrorist organizations before. So the US has built a lot of allegiances. It's kind of got a very strong alliance with India right now. It's got a weakish alliance with Pakistan. So it's got a whole lot of allies in that region. It's not in the same strategic situation that it was before. And so that's changed, actually, the role that Israel needs to play for the United States. So my view is actually that the US, in a very covert way, although overtly it's as supportive as Israel as it ever was, in fact more so because Israel is committing, if not a genocide, then a quasi-genocide in Gaza. But covertly, the US is actually pulling back from its support for Israel. And I think that's relevant to what you were just saying, because I think one sees a similar kind of dynamic somewhere like South Africa. The Zionist formations in South Africa do have undue influence, I would agree, in certain domains. But I don't think it comes anywhere close to the influence of more powerful groupings, right? So I don't think Israeli interests in South Africa are ever going to trump US interests in South Africa. Let me put it that way. I don't think they're going to trump UK's interests in South Africa. And those are the old interests, right? The UK's interests go back to colonial times, right? The US has been the most powerful actor in the post-World War II period. So as much as I'm generally on the same side as people who are very critical of like the Zionist lobby and various Zionist groupings, just to say, to support your point, I came across some information that the South African Zionist Federation sponsored trips for South African editors and journalists to Israel, basically like propaganda junkets. And a certain high-profile South African commentator led those. But anyway, I'll write about that once I've got all the I's dotted and T's crossed. But suffice to say, they have had undue influence. But I still think I don't think that if there is a dominant force, external force in the South African judiciary, which of course there should not be, but I wouldn't say it's them.
Okay, they just know they are like a mafia that have got access because of their skin color and...
Yeah, the thing is skin color is an interesting one because like I say, these kinds of power groupings and structures that I've referred to, they know that certain kinds of demographics are only going to get them so far, right? You can push Helen Zille so far, but I don't think Helen Zille, I think you'd have to fully rig an election for Helen Zille to win that election herself. Same for Steenhuisen and so forth. So you're going to find proxies. So the caution I would say is that one should be, you know where we started in this conversation, in my view, generally about white South Africans, is that their attitudes have not changed adequately since apartheid or indeed colonialism. But having said that, these power groupings find proxies who do not have the same skin color because that's more strategic. So unfortunately, it's not a very good indicator on its own. And I think the majority of the proxies basically, the whole point is like, you don't need. Like, for example, I'm trying to think about how to phrase this. Let's say a foreign government a Western government wants to influence South African democracy to serve its own interests. They don't really need to go and recruit white people in the DA because those people already hold the same views anyway, right? They're wanting to serve the same interests. What you have to go and do is recruit people who look different, right? And who speak differently, right? So, I mean, former friends of mine who've been, let's say, compromised by some of these external interests, still go around like pretending to be radical Pan-Africanists, you know? I mean, I can think of some from other countries. And that's what makes them useful. If you're going around just talking like a normal right-wing white DA person, you're not that useful because everybody sees you as such. To be useful, you have to be able to occupy that. Remember what I said about occupying space? You have to occupy those other spaces. So sometimes the people who are most captured are the people who seem most radical. That's one of probably the most important lesson I've learned over the last decade or so. My former friends and acquaintances who were the shoutiest radicals have turned out to be the most compromised ones. And so I guess what I would always say to people is like, yes, of course, they're the ones who on the surface, if somebody looks captured on the surface, they probably are, right? But don't think that because they don't look captured or because they look the opposite of captured that they're not, right? Always be aware, like, organizations speak about, like some actual civil society organizations talk about the problem of the agent provocateur, right? You're maybe an environmental rights organization in the UK. This is a real thing that happened. You're an environmental rights organization in the UK, and somebody in your group, you go and protest at a store which is like producing products that are harmful to the environment or whatever, so you go to protest there, and then one person in your group is like, let's burn it down. And they burn it down, right? They all get arrested, they all get put in jail. Turns out that guy was working for the intelligence agencies. He was the agent provocateur, but he was the most radical, right? So why would you doubt the most radical person? Well, and it's difficult because we're trying to build communities, we're trying to help each other understand the world better. We're trying to build communities that can improve our society and so forth. And yet at the same time, unfortunately, because of these kinds of external influences, we also have to be a little bit careful about who we trust and who we give credibility to. And unfortunately, that's something that's earned over time for all of us.
Yeah. You're making me think of this black radical that's on ENCA. And I mean, on a human level, obviously, I send out my respect and everything. But when I turned on my third eye, his rants seemed very performed. And when I watch his YouTube channel, because he's not necessarily on screen, he's just politically commenting there. But it almost seems as if it's actually written by a white person and just read by him. I'm not saying this is a fact, but I'm like, you don't really speak like this, but the language you're using is very, because it's a white timber, you know? So speaking to what you're saying, which is these radical voices.
And again, it's because if you really care about control and power, then you have to kind of control the full space, right? And that also, it's also why one has to be very selective about political leaders. It's one of the reasons why I'm quite skeptical about the EFF, for example. Not because I'm skeptical about the majority of the party. I think the majority of members of the EFF and maybe even like office bearers genuinely believe what they say.
Yes.
But I'm less convinced about the top level people.
Same.
And I mean, there is some public speculation and so forth, history to justify that. But yes, and I mean, look, this also applies, certain kinds of left-wing academics that I've come across, supposedly left-wing, very shouty left-wing academics.
That's what I'm saying.
Also, you go back into their past, there's certain kinds of things that just don't add up. So I mean, I think the tricky thing is how to like balance that awareness, and you really have to have that awareness. And I do push people that I talk to about this, because the thing is, and I mean, this could easily have happened to me, and it happens to lots of good people who I know. You can waste your entire life, actually. If you care about these political things, you can waste your entire life by following this particular person. Maybe you idolize this particular academic or this particular political leader. 20 years down the line, you're going to find out they were working for the other side. I mean, if ultimately it's your life, you can decide. But I don't want to waste my life like that, right? I don't want to waste my life like believing in people that certain kinds of people are going to bring change, when in fact they're just a co-opted version of the same power structures that we're trying to deal with. And unfortunately, in my experience, it's the norm. And you can actually map it. Like, I've seen it with people. There's a certain, you're talking about the kind of trajectory, like this other podcaster, right? Suddenly they're just moving up at a strangely rapid pace.
Yes.
I can tell you it's exactly the same dynamic with some of these former friends of mine in academia. Suddenly they're getting book deals here. Suddenly they're getting appointed to this high level commission here. And it's not, because these are my peers. I know what caliber they are. And it's not even just compared to me, but I know what they're like compared to our classmates, compared to our colleagues. It's like, why is this person? And then, if you look carefully enough, you can see like the funding sources sometimes and so forth. Of course, the really covert ones, it's harder, but oftentimes just that like strangely stratospheric trajectory is a warning sign.
To even put it a little bit more, go in a bit more, there is no true radical leftist on any mainstream media. I don't care who says what. I don't much care how much respect they're giving you, whatever. There is no true radical leftist in any of our media.
Yeah. I think it's impossible. They wouldn't survive.
No.
Even if there was such a person, they wouldn't last.
They'd kick them out.
They'd find some reason to get rid of them. There'll be a restructuring or, you know, oh, we had to abolish your post, or sorry, you know, we can't pay the rate that you wanted. They'd construct some kind of thing. The person would leave. They'd get somebody else in who was more politically pliable.
I mean, even when you look at our journalists now, you know, post 2020 resets, you're like, but who are these people?
Right.
We don't.
But even more so, post 2020, you're right.
Yes.
And even more so since post 2024.
But I say post 2020 because I get the sense that 2020 era taught the powers that be how it works. So that's where they tested the control of information and how they can actually use the media. And I think those lessons that they got from there are the ones that they put into 2024, and now we're on our way.
I think that's not giving them enough credit. I think they had those systems pretty well worked out actually already. I think something else happened. I think what happened sort of when was Phala Phala? I've forgotten the year that it happened.
Okay,
well, actually, it's also not about when it happens. It was when it was exposed. But for me, I think what's the key thing that's happened in South Africa has been like the shift in Ramaphosa's approach and his role. And my theory is that he was, you know, I think there's lots of doubt about, you know, who he was really working with in the apartheid era, how close he was to the mining bosses and so forth. But let's say we just take his version, his public version. He's a lawyer. He's also very careful about what he says about himself in Parliament and elsewhere. I mean, he's very careful. But his version, or the version of his biographer, who's also very, you know, again, like I thought the biography of Ramaphosa by Anthony Butler was good at the time, and then I realized afterwards I was naive, and I realized that there was a whole lot of stuff that had been left out, and that Anthony Butler is actually a very problematic British academic who came through to South Africa in the 1990s, for what reasons I'm not entirely sure, and ended up writing the biography of our future president, which is an interesting thing. It's also interesting. It's also interesting to go and look, like, who's writing the profiles of Winnie Mandela? Why is Johnny Steinberg writing the profile of Winnie Mandela? Why is Anthony Butler writing the profile of Cyril Ramaphosa? You know, etc., etc. These, again, it's like, it's in every area, whether it's in books, whether it's in academic work, you know, certain kinds of academics who are now like the go-to person on South African history only came to the country 5 or 10 years ago. Why? There's lots of people who've been doing great work on South African history. So
even that lady Janet Love, what is she doing at IEC?
Essentially, I believe she might be a family acquaintance from the struggle era. But you know, the struggle. Yeah, look, Nziki, there's a lot obviously that we could unpack. There's many layers.
Yeah.
Because also, you know, I look at the kind of people. So again, I come from an anti-apartheid family, right? It's interesting to look at the kinds of people that Ramaphosa appoints. The white people. Let's talk about the white people, right? His parliamentary councillor is a former apartheid, I believe a former apartheid politician, if I'm not mistaken. Okay? Who's this guy? I've forgotten his name now. Is he one of the deputy ministers of justice, who is the son of a former apartheid politician who was born in the United States? And he apparently was very pivotal in the so-called GNU negotiations, which have been completely misrepresented, by the way. That's something else I want to write about. There's this notion that the ANC won those negotiations. It's completely untrue. It's just based on the cabinet positions. But that's very superficial. So anyway, we can get back to that. But he was apparently an important mover in that. So Ramaphosa, he also has these he's handed over a lot of public sector work, for lack of a better word, through the presidency to white CEOs who are completely unaccountable. I mean, they're unaccountable because they're CEOs, not because they're white, but essentially to the private sector, to these vested interests. When you look at the kind of white people that Ramaphosa appoints, if you come from an anti-apartheid background, anti-apartheid family, you're thinking...
problematic.
Why are you appointing like apartheid-adjacent people? And then, of course, there's a few struggle people. And honestly, given the apartheid-adjacent people he's been appointing, I start wondering about those struggle people. That's what I'm going to say. Yeah.
Okay, so, Ish, you know, you're such a killjoy there on Twitter. And the other day, I saw you destroy my image of Hlumelo Biko.
Oh, yeah.
So what are you saying? What are you saying in that? I mean, because you always like, yeah.
I'm not, in some ways I feel like I'm not saying anything that interesting. I'm really just saying, you see, the thing is, once you understand the dynamics of how these things work, once you've seen it enough times, it's almost like, I already know. Sometimes before I even have to go and do research on somebody, if I see a certain kind of person being appointed to a certain kind of position, I know it cannot be what it seems. Yeah. Right? So this whole national dialogue, let's talk about the national dialogue. Yes. I mean, the national dialogue is self-evidently already a joke, okay? But it's not even a joke in the way that people are saying it. So first of all, like when Ramaphosa became president in 2018, I was one of those people who's writing saying, and I gave Ramaphosa the benefit of the doubt. So now this whole cynicism, but I did give him the benefit of the doubt, and I was supportive of this idea of a social compact, and I do believe that he had, even now he has, but it's too late now, but he had the skills to implement a genuine social compact, which is what we needed, right? So that's give and take from all sectors of society. But one of the things that killed that was basically big business said, no, we just want to take, we don't want to give. I mean, almost in so many words. I've forgotten her name now, the head of one of the business organizations basically came out and said, why do you want more contributions from business? We've given enough already. What are you talking about? I mean, you're all ridiculously, horribly rich. Your companies are making huge profits. What do you mean you've given enough? And look at what's happening in the country, inequality, unemployment, so forth. But basically, his business constituency, and what does it mean to call it a constituency? Because there's such a small number of people, but they have so much influence over them. They basically said, well, we're not playing that. So they tasked Ramaphosa with basically coming up with a fake social compact, which involved everybody else giving and them taking, right? And also foreign governments, right? Foreign geopolitical interests, like in the energy space. Okay, but he didn't really do the actual social compact thing. He gave up on it. That's what's now being revitalized under this national dialogue. Okay, but as I say, the power brokers behind the GNU are these billionaire funders and some foreign Western governments. So there's no way they would ever appoint somebody to lead this national dialogue if that person wasn't compromised. So it's like you don't actually even have to go and look at the facts. But of course I go and look at the facts just so that people can see what's there. So Hlumelo Biko is the chairperson of Ogilvy's, which is a big international sort of marketing and PR organization. Its founder was a British person who at some point worked for the British intelligence services, and the people who want to excuse that would say, oh, it was during World War II and so forth. Yes, okay, but also everybody acknowledges once a spy, or once, an intelligence propagandist, always an intelligence propagandist, okay? But the point is, board appointments are a very good indication. Again, you'll never get any actual left-wing radical appointed to a private sector board. You won't even get reasonable centrists appointed to these boards. You really have to be somebody who can be fully relied on to serve these interests at the cost of the public interest.
Like a Prince Mashele.
So and again, Prince Mashele, somebody who was involved in lying about that book about Herman Mashaba, a fundamentally unethical thing. As far as I'm concerned, given that he should never appear on a panel ever again. Why does he appear on the panels? Because he can be relied on to criticize the ANC. He can be relied on to take certain kinds of positions, right? So this is again the double standard. These are not principled people. They'll happily ignore. I'm aware of academics who, there's a particular academic seen an advert for a post of this organization the other day, resigned from WITS to avoid sexual harassment charges, which is almost as good as admitting you're guilty because you're a professor, you have all the friends to fight this legally. If you were falsely accused, you could have stayed there and fought it out. You resigned, but the media have basically papered over that and
because I haven't heard about this.
Yeah,
because we would have been making noise.
There was a period of WITS where a whole bunch of academics were charged with various kinds of inappropriate behavior, but it actually revealed some deeper dynamics. So this was one of those, and now this guy runs an institute which one of its main areas of work is ethics in the public service. Right? And he will be put on panels and he'll be invited to big media houses to give commentary on this, right? But right now we're seeing like I think it's Judge Mbenenge, I think is in the Eastern Cape Division. Right? Now, again, it sounds to me like he's guilty of inappropriate behavior in the workplace, and action should probably be taken against him.
It definitely sounds like
But you see how the media behaves differently with quite similar cases, right? And in one case, it's their friends who serve certain kinds of interests, and in this other case, people who are not their friends who don't serve those interests, or who maybe have slightly different political biases. Okay? So, but I think, what were we talking about? We're talking about the GNU. Oh, yes, and you're talking about Hlumelo Biko. I mean, yeah, unfortunately, I mean, the national dialogue, so now what's the current performance? The current performance is the DA is withdrawn from the national dialogue. Big deal. Lindiwe Mazibuko is there, who is basically a DA proxy, or she's a proxy actually for the same interests. And she said she left the DA, but she said herself that she still held to most of the values and principles and policies of the DA. Right? So she's going to be there. Bobby Godsall, who is one of the jolly old chaps from the Anglo-Oppenheimer kind of network, is going to be there. The guy one of the founders of Nando's is going to be there. And you might think, oh, Nando's, so what? Oh, but the Nando's was funded by the Enthovens, which is another one of these apartheid billionaire families, right, who also fund civil society organizations. So the point is, it doesn't matter whether the DA is there or not, because the interests behind the DA, they have their people. They have their people there, and Ramaphosa has deliberately put together a terrible group of people for this national dialogue. So it's a bunch of like high-profile people who are just like malleable, because they don't really have politics, they don't really have depth, whatever it is. There's somebody like Siya Kolisi, who's like Rainbow Nation figure, right? But it's definitely not like on the sort of politically deep side of things.
No.
So you have all these like figureheads, but then you have the people who are going to be really running the show. And the people who are really going to be running the show are the people who serve the interests of the funders of the DA. So either the national dialogue is just going to be completely useless, or most likely it's going to be rigged in this direction. Yep. And you can see that from the fact that the narrative is like, oh, we want all the citizens to be involved, we want people to be actively involved. Where's the invitation? Have you received the invitation?
And I'm a loudmouth.
And have you? And
I was surprised, right?
I've gone to the presidency website.
Yep.
I can't find it. So they don't really want people to be involved. They're going to have this rigged. I don't care, actually. There's a lot of controversy.
None of the loudmouths are there.
There's a lot of controversy about the 700 million. I don't think 700 million is an unreasonable amount if this thing was going to do what it's supposed to do. But it's not. It's going to be this completely rigged process to manufacture some kind of fake consensus to hide what's really going on. And what's really going on are the things that we've been talking about, is the fact that essentially South African democracy is controlled by these small set of interest groups who now control the political domain almost as much as they control the other parts of the domain. So whatever comes out of this thing, one thing we know is that it will not threaten their interests.
No.
That's guaranteed. And that's true of the whole like GNU. That's where we are right now.
And apparently, word around town is saying that there are these camps that the rich people are having where they're grooming the new crop of leaders.
Oh, sure.
And I mean, I heard one or two names, because some of the private school kids I went to school with, who are not problematic. Even their politics are very white. I see them on social media now. So they
not problematic in a good way, or not problematic?
Not problematic for whites.
Okay.
They are very good blacks, and they parrot what's happening, and they speak good English, and they're articulate, and then they just speak this narrative, this whiteness narrative, and those are the kind of blacks that they've chosen for these camps. I believe even Lindiwe Mazibuko is there, and apparently quite...
well, Lindiwe Mazibuko is running this Future Elects organization, which was previously called, ironically, Apolitical. And it was called Apolitical because it was funded by a UK consultancy called Apolitical, which got most of its money from the British government. So essentially, she was running a foreign-funded, like, leadership thing. And what look,
maybe
the
this
point
is
of
it.
Yeah, but no, but the thing is, there's like tons of these things. I mean, I studied at Oxford for a period of time. I was on a scholarship there. And you quickly see there's all these different, it's like World Economic Forum Young Leaders, there's the Schmidt Fellows, there's the Rhodes, there's the this, there's the that, there's the Future Elect, and it's all, what I've come to realize is that you know, and when I was much younger, I didn't know about this, right? I mean, at least I had the good sense. I only applied for things if, like, I needed a scholarship, but I never applied for these things that were just about, you know, like this World Economic Forum thing or anything like that. I was always just like, these just seem too weird, right? But essentially what you realize is that almost all of these things are really about identifying potential societal leaders at a young age. The ones who are already amenable to your interests, you promote as much as possible. And the ones who aren't, you try and co-opt or potentially neutralize if they're threatening enough. And what's scary is that, you know, like this, just one anecdote, this Schmidt Fellowship. This Schmidt is Eric Schmidt, who's a billionaire, one of the co-founders of Google, who's also served on like Donald Trump's Defense Advisory Board, I think, under his first term. And Schmidt starts, I can't remember what it's called now, but it's basically a program to find young leaders between the ages of like 16 and 18. So at this point, you're not even going for adults, you're going for children, for teenagers. And the purpose, I really think, is to find and co-opt talented young people from a very young age. And so I don't want to suggest that everybody who participates in these programs is compromised. I don't think that's true, because I think a lot of people apply for them naively, right? They're like, oh yeah, I want to make a difference in the world, whatever. And it's just that but these are the only opportunities because that's where the money flows. Right, and they can give you scholarships, and they can, you know, take you to these expensive venues and do all these kinds of fun activities and so forth. We as a society should be making that possible through publicly funded initiatives that are not compromised. But unfortunately, they tend to be run by these other organizations. So I'm sure what you're saying is true, but I think it's just the current instantiation of something that's been going on for decades, maybe not centuries, but definitely many decades. And that's why, like I say, I mean, they pick people. They pick the people who can best serve their interests. And the sooner they find them, the better, because then the person can, like, develop credibility. So the influence is more covert. Whereas if, like, you know, if it's the Oppenheimers funding Songezo Zibi as soon as he starts a political party, it's kind of obvious. But if you could get Songezo Zibi when he's 18, right, and then he naturally develops his own popularity, and he can raise that 100 million from people who actually believe that he's a progressive. Someone like Zoran Mamdani in New York, for example, who I think is also in the same category. So yeah, unfortunately, I'm very much like raining on parades these days. Because people are very excited about Mamdani. He's the son of a very famous left-wing progressive academic. I don't have any reason to believe his father isn't the progressive he says he is, although one always has to be cautious. But I don't think Mamdani, again, that stratospheric rise, getting like softball profiles in CNN. Socialists don't get softball profiles in CNN, right? The example I always like to use is from the UK, Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, who was this kind of like uncle-like democratic socialist in the UK. He really he wasn't going to do anything super radical, also just because he understood the limitations of the system. But he was a genuine left-wing activist. And the British media and British establishment destroyed him. And they just manufactured stuff. They literally just made up things. But it wasn't just the right-wing press. It was also the supposed left-wing progressive press, like The Guardian, which is supposed left-wing liberal. So that's a good sign. That's a good indicator, right? So if you go and look at what happened to Corbyn, and it's also been documented by some very good academics who went and literally surveyed all the media coverage, right? And just found like heavily systematic bias. But I think what Corbyn showed, the most interesting thing about that experience is what actually happens to left-wing type progressives or radicals in Western democracies when they start developing popular support. And they just get destroyed. And what that kind of shows is that it's not really a democracy, right? Because it's not like he was a Stalinist or somebody, or somebody, you know, because obviously the Soviet Union's gone, or somebody who's going to like take over the UK for the Soviet Union or something. He was really just going to bring in genuine left-wing politics for 5 or 10 years until, you know, he got voted out and whoever else came in. But that was too much of a threat, right? So they destroyed him. So somebody like Mamdani in New York, I don't buy it. I think he's probably just another establishment front. But again, there are well-meaning young Americans who are looking for change, who are going to back Mamdani. They're going to go to his campaigns. They're going to donate. They're going to knock on doors. They're going to do all of that. And they might do that for the next 10 years till he becomes president. He'll disappoint like Obama did, because Obama went the same recipe, right? Maybe they'll become jaded. They'll opt out of politics, or maybe they'll have hope in the next one, right? And so they keep just wasting our time, wasting wasting generations of effort. really. And that's why I think it's so important to actually identify these dynamics and identify these people early, because we don't have that much time, really.
I know, right? Thank you, Sean.
Always a pleasure.
Thank
Thanks
you
for having
so
me.
much. So enlightening, guys. That was Seán Mfundza Muller. Sure, yeah, it's a handful. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Members, this shout out is for you. Thank you so much for keeping the lights on. See you again next time.
Who are you when all you were has been diluted by lies and white lines cancelling out all that which has been written of your history? Why do you look at yourself as a mystery? Doesn't the sun shine because you open your eyes? Doesn't the moon stay situated within the same stars your DNA sparkles off? Your spirit knows that surely corner into it off. Buza umoya so you may return to being well off. Because spiritually you are rich, yet your ancestors cry because you are out of reach. But yours is to command all elements while God takes inspiration from the very mirror she looked at to become. Remember who you are and never finish just when they think that with you they are done.